We often think about the American Civil War as dividing families and brother fighting against brother. But the story of Mary and Nathaniel Williams is a case of a family divided over the cause of American independence 85 years before the Civil War began. Today, this marker on Mississippi Avenue at the bottom of Eagle Rock Avenue marks the spot across from the farm where Mary and Nathaniel Williams once lived. Here is where our story begins about the third oldest surviving West Orange artifact. When the colonists declared independence in 1776, not everyone was in support of the cause. This was especially true here in West Orange with the Williams family, who were known as Tories, which was the name given to all those who remained loyal to the British. In the spring of 1777, Nathaniel Williams could not bring himself to take allegiance with the American patriots. Instead, he decided to leave the family farm and take his two oldest sons, Amos and James, to join the British forces in New York City. Mary Williams refused to join him and remained behind with their four youngest children on the family farm that was located somewhere here in this parking lot on Elm Street, just above Mississippi Avenue. She was deeply committed to the cause for American independence, and it caused her great hardship, but it was a sacrifice she was willing to make in the name of liberty. Her next oldest son, Zenith, who remained here with her, became a soldier and fought for the Americans with the Essex militia. The Revolutionary War had not only divided their family, but also caused deep resentment as brother faced brother and father faced son, perhaps not on the battlefield, but certainly in an ideological stance for an American independence. Before Nathaniel Williams left the family farm in West Orange, he had in his possession a tall case clock, better known as a grandfather clock. The name of the clockmaker, Stephen Tickner of Newark, was shown on the top of the clock. This helps date the clock to at least 1760 because Tickner is listed as being in this book of all known clockmakers in New Jersey at that time. In fact, this book also contains a picture of a clockworks made by Stephen Tickner identical to the Williams clock. My suspicion is that since Mary and Nathaniel Williams were married in 1755, the clock could even have been a wedding gift. We of course have no way of knowing that as a fact. What we do know is that the clock belonged to them and dates to at least 1760. When Nathaniel left to join the British forces in New York City, he gave the clock to his brother Benjamin for safekeeping, who stayed behind in present-day West Orange. Benjamin Williams was also a Tory, but he pledged allegiance to the American patriots only so he could keep his farm and retain his comfortable lifestyle. Nathaniel had every intention of returning to West Orange and retrieving the clock from his brother Benjamin following a British victory. However, Nathaniel never came back to West Orange because he died of smallpox in New York City in 1782. The clock of Mary and Nathaniel Williams then became the property of his brother Benjamin and subsequently passed through 3 generations of the Williams family. By 1910, the clock had been passed on to Selina Williams, the great-granddaughter of Benjamin Williams. This fact is documented in this book, which is a 4-part volume set entitled The Genealogical and Memorial History of the State of New Jersey, published in 1919. I'm paraphrasing, but it quotes, "In possession of Selina Williams of Orange is a tall old grandfather clock that has come down to her from the time of the Revolution and originally belonged to her great-uncle Nathaniel Williams." Once Selina Williams passed away in 1922, the trail of the clock went missing and apparently was lost to history. It would have stayed that way had fate not intervened. In 2008, a collector named Doug Raymond spotted a brass clockworks at a flea market in Bloomington, Illinois. There was a note attached to the clock's door, which was the only remaining piece of the clock's original cabinet, and this caught Doug's attention. The undated note was signed by Selina Williams and stated that the clock belonged to her great-grandfather Benjamin Williams, and even mentioned Tory Corner in West Orange. These clues may have been vague to Doug, but they ultimately saved the clock from permanent obscurity. Doug subsequently contacted me, and I explained to him the clock's history. Had it not been for Selina Williams' note attached to the cabinet door, the clock would have been gone forever. Doug had unknowingly found a lost Williams clock, but decided to keep it. I remained in touch with Doug and would contact him from time to time, asking if I could buy the clock. He always declined my offers, but after several years I was finally able to convince him to let me purchase it. He also realized that this lost artifact belonged back in West Orange. In 2014, the clock of Mary and Nathaniel Williams returned to West Orange thanks to the help of several generous benefactors who contributed to the purchase price of $3,000. The Williams clock, which has a well-documented history, dates to 1760 and is older than Jemima Condit's diary, which dates to 1772 by about 12 years. Therefore, I consider this clock West Orange's third oldest surviving artifact. The actual clock was what we call a grandfather clock and would have stood over 6 feet tall. The clock would actually have been constructed by two different tradesmen. A clockmaker would have made the clockworks, and a carpenter would have built the cabinet that housed the clockworks. What you see here is the actual clockworks that belonged to Mary and Nathaniel Williams, housed in a reproduction cabinet that only represents the top third of what would have been an entire tall case clock or grandfather clock. This, however, is the original cabinet door of that clock case. This undated note signed by Selina Williams identifies this as the lost William clock. If this clock and cabinet door could talk, it likely could tell us all about the spirited conversations Mary and Nathaniel Williams had over the cause for American independence and how they arrived at the decision that ultimately divided their family during the American Revolutionary War. I'm here outside the entrance to Llewellyn Park on Main Street. This is where our story begins about West Orange's second oldest surviving artifact. Historians generally agree that the first permanent settler arrived within the present-day boundaries of West Orange in 1678. His name was Anthony Olaf, who settled on 60 acres of land when the whole mountainside was nothing but a dense forest and pristine wilderness nestled in the abundant natural beauty of the rugged Orange Mountains. Exactly where Anthony Olaf lived was located in current-day Llewellyn Park nearly 177 years before the park was founded. Olaf's home was located a few feet north of the present-day intersection of Tulip Avenue and Oak Bend. Last year, William Davis, a resident of Llewellyn Park and independent filmmaker, made this film entitled Secrets of Llewellyn Park. His film featured many Llewellyn Park residents who told, among other things, the history of their houses and property. One Llewellyn Park resident, Alan Bennett, seen in the film, believes the carriage house on his property is the oldest structure in Llewellyn Park and part of Llewellyn Haskell's first land purchase and was Olaf's former home. I have not seen the carriage house other than on this film, but no doubt it has been renovated and updated over the years. It does bear some resemblance to documented descriptions of other homes from that time period. Let's listen to Mr. Bennett describe the carriage house on his property, courtesy of William Davis's movie, Secrets of Llewellyn Park.
We're standing in front of the carriage house that is part of the property, and we think it is the oldest structure in Llewellyn Park and maybe in the entire surrounding area. This property was a parcel of a large tract of land bought by a Swede by the name of Olaf back in the late 1600s. And we think that this little house here was part of that original homestead, which was purchased by Llewellyn Haskell as the beginning of Llewellyn Park.
When Anthony Olaf passed away in 1723 at age 87, he was the first person interred here at the old burying ground on the corner of Main Street and Scotland Road in Orange. A few photos of his grave taken in the 1890s show us today what his tombstone looked like over 100 years after his death, and at a time when the graveyard was better maintained. Several local history books confirm that Anthony Olaf was the first person buried in this church graveyard. But this church document from the 1850s, written by then pastor William White of the First Presbyterian Church of Orange, further indicates that Olaf was the first. It specifically states here, the first burial in our yard was in 1723, a man by the name of Anthony Olaf. Not much is known about Olaf's early life or where he came from. His name is Swedish and spelled Olive, but the correct pronunciation is believed to be Olaf. All we really know is that he was born in 1636, 16 years before the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. His grave sits among many of the early settlers to the area. His tombstone was reported to be the oldest in Essex County, but the original was replaced in 1969 with this contemporary grave marker that now marks the location of his burial site. When the church celebrated their 250th anniversary in 1969, they decided to honor Anthony Olaf with a new grave marker. In doing so, they removed his original tombstone from the cemetery, which had been undisturbed for 246 years, and placed it inside the church. Although it was on display for church members to see, only a relatively small amount of people actually saw it, and even a fewer number even know it existed. In 2010, the First Presbyterian Church of Orange closed its doors forever, ending nearly 300 years of history in the Oranges. For the last 6 years, both the church and cemetery slipped further below the threshold of public awareness as a decaying and neglected monument to our community heritage. Sadly overlooked by the passage of time and forgotten by the masses to the historic role that this church once played in the development of the Oranges. But earlier this year, the First Shiloh Baptist Church of West Orange purchased the old First Presbyterian Church property in Orange, including the old cemetery. They plan on reopening the church and are committed to doing their best to preserving the centuries of history contained on their new property. Pastor Jacob Vitale of the First Shiloh Baptist Church generously gave me possession of Olaf's 293-year-old tombstone on August 30th, 2016 for historic safekeeping. It clearly dates to 1723, and because Olaf was West Orange's first settler, this can be considered West Orange's second oldest surviving artifact. Although it was broken off at the base, and it is not as tall as it once was, the information that was engraved on the face is still visible. I intend to have Olaf's original tombstone, and perhaps the oldest in Essex County, to be soon placed on permanent public display back in West Orange as a tangible link and visible reminder of our local history. No street bears the name, but Olaf's original tombstone will continue to mark the existence of his life. The name of Anthony Olaf will now hopefully be known to all future generations as the town's first resident and the original West Orange mountaineer. But even more amazing is that this 293-year-old tombstone is not West Orange's oldest surviving artifact, because I found one that is 5 years older. I'm here on Freeman Street, where our story begins about West Orange's oldest surviving artifact. The name Freeman dates to 1666, when the first settlers arrived from Connecticut and sailed up the Passaic River, arriving on shore in what is modern-day Newark. Following subsequent land purchases, it became known as the Newark Settlement and encompassed most of the land of present-day Essex County. Orange was eventually formed when it separated from the Newark Settlement, and West Orange was eventually formed when it separated from Orange. By 1700, settlers had begun to migrate to the western part of the Newark Settlement, and by 1719 they were known as the Mountain Society and living in what would become West Orange. Stephen Freeman and his wife Hannah were among the original Newark settlers in 1666, and one of the signers of the fundamental agreement that specified how the newly formed settlement of Newark would be governed. As settlers began to occupy the western part of the territory, small hamlets began to pop up and were known by the name of the principal landowners in the area. The name of Freeman is no stranger to local history, and Freemantown was the name of one of these early hamlets on the current-day Orange-West Orange border. It later became known as the Orange Valley, and today the land is part of both towns. Over the years, the original land holdings of the Freeman family were passed on to their descendants. By 1890, George Freeman, a descendant of Stephen Freeman, was living in the old Freeman homestead on South Valley Road in West Orange, where this blue house behind me now sits. The original house was built in 1815 by his grandfather Cyrus Freeman, and old maps show the state occupying nearly all the land between South Valley Road and Gregory Avenue, bordered by Walker Road. Early in the 20th century, the surrounding property began to be subdivided. The Freeman house that once sat here survived to 1977 before being torn down, and the current-day streets of Oxford, Yale, and Harvard Terrace, Orange Heights Avenue, and all the land for the Gregory Avenue School were carved out from the original Freeman property. The late Thomas Hunt grew up in West Orange, and in 1973 he purchased this house on Walker Road from Mrs. Eleanor Groves. She was the daughter of George Freeman, who is a descendant of Stephen Freeman, and the house was built in 1922 on the last subdivided lot of the original Freeman property. Hunt told me in 2009 that when he first saw the inside of the house, Mrs. Grove had old muskets and swords hanging on the wall that belonged to the Freeman family ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War. But none of these historic items stayed in the house when it was sold. Hunt said that the only thing Mrs. Grove left behind was a leaking washing machine, but there was one thing remaining that had just not yet been discovered. In 1988, Hunt's son Matt, now a West Orange Township employee, was playing in this detached garage on the property with several of his friends. The garage had an older style pull-up door that didn't work properly and therefore was always left open. But while opened, it concealed part of the rafters above that created a dark and perhaps mysterious area that attracted Matt and his adventurous friends to explore one afternoon. In doing so, they unintentionally disturbed a hidden object and caused it to fall. It was an old box that got jammed between the top of the open door and the bottom of the exposed rafters that had been there for years. Apparently, Mrs. Groves had unknowingly left something behind after all relating to Freeman family history. The box that fell from the rafters that day contained wills, deeds, and other documents chronicling nearly 290 years of the Freeman family history. Some of these papers eventually were used by various authors as original source materials in writing the history of the Oranges. The oldest document is nearly 300 years old and was this original land deed from Samuel Lyon, dated May 1st, 1718, that mentions Lord George of England in the 4th year of his reign. Stephen Lyon was one of the original settlers of Newark in 1666 and sold land to Stephen Freeman in 1718. This document represents the sale of land that became the Freeman property in present-day West Orange. In some ways, it can even be considered a birth certificate of the Oranges because it set in motion a series of subsequent land sales. The Hunt family has now entrusted this document to me to preserve for local history. What Matt Hunt accidentally dislodged from the rafters that day fell from the sky and has landed in the lap of the 21st century, like a message in a bottle that has floated ashore to tell its story for future generations to discover as West Orange's oldest surviving artifact. For the Downtown West Orange Alliance, I'm Joe Fagan, and I'll see you on Main Street.